Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, your host for the next 60 minutes. The TNT Show and Indy Live are growing and delivering more exciting shows. For example, you can watch the TNT Show on indylive.net. It's streamed out on YouTube and Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus, on YouTube, you can watch all of the previous more than 160 shows. Now, you may be wondering why we're a little bit tardy tonight. It's because we're having some internet problems with our guest. We may have lost him again, but we'll persevere and he may well come back. I hope he does, because he has a lot to say. Now, I say each week, and it's even more true now than it ever has been, that many would say that the fourth estate in Scotland is mostly fourth rate. Now, that's not because necessarily a condemnation of journalists, but I would think that the editors are certainly fourth, if not fifth rate. So if you're upset by media coverage, well, this is the place to come. You can join us every Wednesday on this show, and Indy Live has other shows as well, which make a meaningful contribution towards a more balanced media environment. And as you know, the media environment is anything but balanced in Scotland. Most of the newspapers are thoroughly committed to a particular constitutional perspective, i.e. a unionist viewpoint, with one notable exception, if you include the Sunday National too. All the others take a somewhat fixated union position, and the BBC, of course, aids and abets that, mainly because, again, its editors share that same perspective. That isn't going to change anytime soon, but some people would say maybe the governing party in Scotland maybe take a more assertive position on the broadcasters. But to imagine that this election campaign will be conducted fairly, frankly, is wishing for the moon. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen because the people in charge, i.e. the people to whom the people in Scotland report, don't want it to happen. Fact. And I think they would probably agree with that too. They have little regard for you watching and listening tonight, or any other people in Scotland. And this was borne out by the so-called debate last night between Rishi and Keir Starmer. In fact, just farcical. Not to mention Scotland at all, having plodded up and down the country simply because it was part of their agenda. I suspect many of them didn't know quite why they were there, and they just said whatever the spin doctors told them to say, safe in the knowledge that the broadcast media and the public prints would cheer them to the echo. And that, again, isn't really going to change, I'm afraid. What needs to happen, I suspect, is that after this is all over and the dust has settled, then the Scottish Parliament may decide that it wants to do a review of election broadcasting. And now many will say, oh, look, but broadcasting is reserved, i.e. it's not devolved, and it's none of the Scottish Parliament's business what the broadcasting is like. Well, I would suggest differently. I think if the broadcasting is sufficiently tainted that it produces a tainted outcome, then that's a danger to us all, and therefore the broadcasters should sit up and take notice. So we'll see. We can perhaps say more about that later when our guest joined us. And who is our guest tonight? Well, I'm happy that we'll be able to join by Graeme McCormick. Now, Graeme McCormick is, you may recall Graeme, at one time contemplated running against John Swinney for leader of the SNP. So he'll be able to enlighten us on that process and to talk about a possible dissolution of the union as well. So lots to talk about. And now to our guest tonight. Now, Graeme may be appearing only on sound, if you'll forgive us for that, but we can't do much with internet connection. So without further ado, let me say hello and welcome to Graeme. How are you, Graeme? Hello? No, I'm afraid we don't have Graeme on sound either. But c'est la vie. In that case, while we're waiting to see if we can connect to him, let me just amplify the point I was making about broadcasting, because it's not going to go away, I'm afraid. It does seem to me that the Scottish authorities have been less than assertive on this matter than perhaps they could have been. And while it's true to say that broadcasting is reserved, nonetheless, its effect on elections is so serious that I think the Scottish Parliament ought to be encouraged to do a review of broadcasting, to see what the people in Scotland think of what has happened over the general election period. Now, it may well be that the authorities in the BBC and ITV will say, well, we're not going to pay any regard to that. That may well be the case. Who knows? I think they're foolish if they take that view, but that's up to them to do that. However, people outside the UK might see things very, very differently and might say to themselves, well, here's a right royal, what's it? We've got a situation here where the BBC is criticising Trump and the Americans generally because of the bias in their broadcasting. Well, if the same thing has happened here that shows that they're not fit for purpose, then that makes a very shallow claim indeed. So before criticising Trump and the Americans, perhaps they ought to look more closely at their own backyard. Furthermore, the BBC desperately needs, as do the newspapers, because of the impact of artificial intelligence, they need to reach out to a more committed and more widespread audience and readership and viewership. That's not going to be helped if people think the BBC is biased. So there's a lot to play for here, and I think perhaps there's an opportunity for the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish authorities generally to do that review of broadcasting over the general election period and to make sure that that's as widely broadcast as possible. Graeme, are you back with us? Hello? Graeme? I think I can hear you. Are you there, Graeme? Hello, Graeme? Graeme? Well, I can hear somebody typing typing away frantically. No, I don't hear from Graeme. So I assume that he's still out there in limbo. Well, that is a shame. We have a number of questions that have come in for Graeme, which I'd like to give him a chance to discuss. But we can't do that, of course, unless we have him online in some way, shape or form, whether it be on visually, which we'd hope for, or perhaps only on audio. But we'll keep trying. We've got a great producer, and he'll be trying frantically to get Graeme back online again. It may be that we're hostage to Graeme's internet connection. Not much any of us can do about that. BT, a bit like the BBC, is run from Westminster or controlled by Westminster. And maybe that's an indictment, I don't know. But it looks to me like Graeme might not be joining us anytime soon. So let me just expand, if I may, for a second or two upon some of the events that have taken place today. Now, very few of you will not, it will not escape the attention of many of you, that the election campaign is not going quite the way that the Labour and Tories wanted. Now, the main sufferers, of course, are the Conservatives, but that's because they have this appalling track record in government. They're saying things like, judge us on our record. Well, if people were to judge them on their record, they wouldn't get any votes at all. I suspect even government ministers wouldn't vote for them. But then there's a larger element as far as Scotland's concerned, and that is the only viable alternative in Westminster terms, I hasten to add in Westminster terms, to the present SNP administration would be a number of votes for Westminster MPs from the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party produced this appalling assertion, which has been derided by every single psephologist and pollster, which is that Labour needs Scottish seats to govern. Just doesn't. You know, if you've got a majority of 400 or odds, you don't need a single MP from Scotland to govern. And more than that, you can govern any which way you like, because the UK's constitution has no constraints over Parliament. and therefore if you control Parliament, there are no constraints over you. That means, for example, that Keir Starmer can, if he wishes, and he may well wish, to behave as cavalierly as Boris Johnson, who took the so-called conventions upon which the UK Constitution so much depends, not specific rules, conventions. I promise not to swear if you promise not to swear. Oh, you've sworn. Oh, what can I do about it? Simple as that. Conventions are not laws. They're not rules. They're not regulations. They're just an understanding. Who wants to run their country on an understanding or a series of understandings? It's pathetic, frankly. I mean, you wouldn't run your local golf club or tennis club on understandings. If you go and join a club anywhere, right? I mean, it could be a local, I don't know, chess club, whatever. You turn up your golf club. It could be your curling club. The first thing that people do is present you with the Constitution. And they say, these are our rules. You need to abide by them if you're going to be a member. Dead simple. We're all used to it. It's not complicated. But what happens to the UK? They don't have a constitution. Where is the constitution? Well, it's spread across 100-odd pages in different places. We don't know quite where it is. Well, can I speak to somebody who does? Well, nobody knows. What do you mean nobody knows the constitution? Well, they don't. Well, hold on a second. I mean, is anyone getting around to making a constitution? No, not really. We're not interested in it. Crazy. I see Graeme might be back with us. I'll try him one more time. Hello, Graeme. Nope. I don't think we have him. Hello, Graeme. Hello. Is there anyone there? Hello? Nope. Well, as and when Graeme comes, maybe he could make a terribly rude noise to grab my attention, and then we'll cut him into this discussion. But I was talking about constitutions and the fact that the Labour Party really doesn't need any MPs based on the polling to govern, and govern in the most extreme way that one can imagine. But nonetheless, it's chosen to hamper itself. It has a leader who is, frankly, hyper cautious, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I mean, it's just crazy to be besides, in what world does it make any sense? I mean, we've just had this opportunity presented to us because of the Prime Minister deciding to step down. And it's a very rare thing indeed. It has to be treasured, I would suggest to you, that there's an election to get rid of the immoral administration that we've suffered in recent years. And you would think then that the opposition would present themselves on a higher moral plane, i.e. to say, if you're sick of all this, the change that we want to provide for you is not amorphous, it's not ill-defined, it's specific. In other words, we will govern ethically, and we will take care of those who are least advantaged. These are simple things. It's not rocket science to say, I'm a moral person and I will run a moral party, because you're then distancing yourself from what exists at present. I mean, even today, the government, the government is gone, of course, but after dissolution. But the fact of the matter is, the Tory party spokespeople just repeated the same lies over and over again. I mean, producing numbers produced by their political associates and just running them with no real basis in actuality. I mean, this is crazy stuff. That's the sort of stuff you do at school politics and stuff, and even then it wouldn't be acceptable. But there they are. They're trying to be the next government, and what they're doing, I mean, crazy. It's absolutely nuts. One more go for Graeme. Hello, Graeme. Can you hear me?
Yes, John, I can. Yes.
Excellent. We're delighted you can join us. Graeme, I've been talking about constitutions, and I think one of the things you wanted to talk about in particular was dissolution. Tell us what you mean by dissolution and how it would work.
Right. Well, dissolution of a union is recognised internationally as a legal way of dissolving a union. It happened most recently, or in connection with the former Czechoslovakia, where that union was dissolved, and Slovakia and the Czech Republic went their separate ways. It's also recognised in international law in the Vienna Convention of, I think it's 1983, in which, in the event of a unilateral dissolution by one former partner, then there are certain rules which are set out in the convention as regards the separation of assets and responsibilities of the the partners of the former state. So it's perfectly recognisable as a legal international route to independence.
So how would it work? Say, for example, after this election, there was a general view in Scotland that the union just hadn't worked. Not just that the BBC and the media hadn't worked, but the union wasn't working, and that the percentage of people who took that view was greater than 50%. How would the process work? What would be the first step?
Well, I think the first step would be that the independent supporting parties would need to have, as part of their manifesto to the public, to make it clear to the public and also to the unionists that in the event of there being a majority of the popular vote in Scotland in favour of parties supporting the dissolution of the United Kingdom, then on that happening, then the majority vote was carried at that election. Then what would then happen would be for the Scottish MPs, independents supporting Scottish MPs, to walk out of Westminster to declare that the union was dissolved, set up a provisional government and parliament in Edinburgh, a sovereign one. This is separate from the current devolved Scottish Parliament, and advise the international community that the union is dissolved and that Scotland will adhere to the terms of the Vienna Convention on the dissolution of a union.
Okay, that sounds perfectly straightforward, but let's look at the detail now. You say a majority. How would this majority be established? I mean, would it be if the SNP, just take the SNP on its own for a second, there may be other independence parties as we know, but let's say the SNP has a majority of seats on July the 4th. Would that constitute a majority?
No, well, my personal view would be that would not be sufficient for the international community. I think the international community would want to see that a majority of the popular vote had been carried and not just a majority of the seats. Because you've basically got to show that the majority of the people who are prepared to vote have done so for dissolution of the union. I think in order to do it by purely the number of MPs who are elected, I think would fall short of what the international community would consider an acceptable norm.
It is a strange one. I mean, effectively what you've just said is that any secession would have to have a greater support than that which is required to form a UK government, where if I have one seat more than you, I'm the government.
Yeah, but we're not basically dealing with we're dealing in the international arena, because we're talking basically about the end of a treaty.
Yeah,
and I think that's different. And of course, every country's got its own means by which it votes, votes parliament, etc.
If, for example, Graeme, in addition to having the majority of MPs, when the votes are all counted up, it turns out that, for the sake of discussion, the SNP has one more vote than all the others. Therefore, i.e., a majority have voted for a separatist outcome.
Yeah.
Would that be sufficient?
Well, that would be sufficient on the basis that it was a majority vote. Obviously, there are practicalities involved in this, and one would also have to be, I suppose, aware and responsive to the attitude and the feeling of those who did not vote for the for independence, and what their reaction is likely to be. So these are things you've got to be aware of. So preferably, it would be far better if we got 60% of the popular vote as opposed to 50% plus one. But these are practical issues that to some extent will be determined by the personalities involved in both sides of the political fence, and also how the general population will feel about that. Because what's happened now is that we are not dealing with a nice Mr. Cameron. We are dealing with people who are in the UK parties who are very, very unlikely to agree to a referendum or agree to a dissolution or Scotland becoming independent. So these people are basically political thugs. So unless they were going to actually sort of change their attitude, we have got to have a means by which we've got to decide whether we are just a pressure group and we keep asking and pressing, etc., in the hope that at some point in the future, the UK government of the day will be reasonable, or we have to basically take the law, and it is the law, international law, into our own hands and say, look here, if you are not prepared to accept that we have a popular mandate to become independent, then we are going to dissolve the union. Now, the big how do we use to actually dissolve the union? Is it going to be the case that if we were successful and had a small majority in favour of dissolving the union, then would that encourage or force the United Kingdom government to actually start to negotiate? And I think probably it's the case that they reluctantly would have to do that, because be in no doubt, because we do not discuss dissolution of the union, that makes the United Kingdom or the UK parties much more comfortable than if we did discuss it, because dissolution is something which they would actually fear. Because with dissolution, what it means is that without an agreement between the two former partners, then one side cannot take a unilateral action which was of the former state of which they were formerly part.
Whoops. We lost you again, Graeme. It doesn't look as if you're coming back anytime soon, but we'll persevere, as we always do. If you're going to do anything in broadcasting, you have to have tenacity and not be fazed by technical issues or anything else for that matter. So we'll continue in the vein. I mean, as you probably gathered, Graeme was making an eloquent case for a form of dissolution that would require a majority. I got the impression it would have to be a considerable majority that could be used to persuade the international community that this dissolution was fitting and that it ought to go ahead. I can see all sorts of advantages to that, but I can see a considerable number of disadvantages. Graeme mentioned the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, which led to two separate states, which appear to be cooperating pretty well. But it's the only form of separation that's occurred in recent past that actually has been, to some degree, harmonious. And most other separations are far from harmonious. And the reason for that is because one of the parties doesn't want it to happen. And therefore, that just means, frankly, that it becomes a matter of negotiation. And negotiation is always about who can hold out longest, i.e., we're back to tenacity again. If you're tenacious, you'll get what you want. But if you're not, then you will get what the other person wants to give you, which very often is not the same thing, sadly, because we're not dealing with reasonableness, we're dealing with what is pejoratively known as realpolitik, where decisions are taken on the interests of one particular state, perhaps to some degree, regardless of the effect those decisions may have on other states or other parts of their state. I just cannot see the present administration or that which might replace it as being cooperative. I mean, we have a putative Prime Minister in Keir Starmer who can't even tell us, in large part, what he stands for. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, every time I listen to him, I get the impression of somebody who's sort of blowing in the wind. You know, how do you feel about tax cuts? Oh, I'm in favour of tax cuts. Ah, okay. What about public services? You know, Tories are going to cut. Yeah, we'll cut them too. Okay. What about immigration? Hey, we're not in favour of immigration either. Oh, really? Yeah. Did you consult with anyone on this? No, I don't have to. And he's right. He doesn't have to. It's a fact. He doesn't have to. Once you get a majority in the House of Commons, you could care less what anyone else thinks. Now, this is the important thing about July the 4th, which is well worth underscoring. And if you get a chance to talk to other people about this, please do, which is that it's the only time, literally, the only time, short of a constitutional revolution, it's the only time that you are sovereign. It's the only time when there's a general election. That's not my words. That's the words of Lord Hailsham. Now, that is the reality of it. I'm not sure if people fully understand and appreciate that. It's a very rare thing to be sovereign in the UK. Very rare. Hi, Graeme. Are you back?
Nope. Yes, I'm back. Sorry,
well done. Well done. We're going to persevere again, Graeme, and hope that you can be with us for a little bit longer this time, because you've got a deeply appreciative audience out there and they want to hear from you. So we talked about dissolution. We talked about a majority. And we've had folks online saying, look, maybe what ought to happen is that the SNP should withdraw and set up a constitutional convention. Is that something you would approve of?
Well, I don't have any objection to a constitutional convention, but the thing is that that has got to be very much a supporting role. At the end of the day, the decision has got to be made by the Scottish MPs, because they are the people that have the right. They have the people by the Treaty of Union that have the right to be represented and form part of the United Kingdom Parliament. And they are the people who have the right to withdraw, because they are basically the successors of the original Scottish MPs. And their right to be there is based on the treaty. It's not based on any Westminster statute or anything like that. So that's why the legal way to dissolve the union is for our representatives, the majority of our representatives, to walk out and dissolve the union. It's actually as simple as that, albeit obviously there's considerable detail that would, and practicalities that would be involved and would have to be recognised and dealt with. But these could be dealt with. But that's the basis. They walk out and say, we declare the union dissolved. And in order to get international legitimacy, they've got to do that on the basis of a majority of the popular vote of Scotland in favour of that.
Well, not just a popular majority, but also a majority of the MPs from Scotland, I gather, is what you also said.
Yes. No. Okay. If you got a majority of the popular vote, then you would get a majority of the MPs. Yeah,
well, not necessarily in first past the post, but
well, I think you would find you would, because with first past the post, if you get about 40 to 42% of the popular vote, you'll get probably the vast majority of the seats too. Can you hear me? No.
Hi, Graeme. It's Kevin, the producer here.
Aye.
We've lost John. Incredibly. So we're having some day today with the TNT show. Okay, Graeme, as a producer, I haven't been paying attention to what you've been saying as usual. I just make sure everything technically as best I can.
Yeah.
it works. So I'm not too sure if you want to continue what you were saying. I'll wait here. Hopefully John will come back on and we'll add him to the screen. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm happy to see it. I'm happy to see it.
He's
Oh, here's
back.
John coming again.
We're having fun tonight, folks. Not
Uh-huh.
only is Graeme disappearing, I'm disappearing too.
It's the unionist's fault.
It is. We have unionist moles at work here, Graeme. Anyway, you and I. Oops, there's somebody else on the phone, but I'm not. Hello.
Hello. Do you hear me?
That's better. I can hear someone else in the background. But
I'm just going to. I'm just going to jump in here, right? One of you have got a browser open with the TNT show running.
Really?
Yeah.
No.
Just check, John. Right, because that's where the feedback's coming from.
I don't know what it is then.
Okay, right. I'm just going to come off. Do your best, guys. Folks, stay with us.
But my StreamYard disappeared. I'm not quite sure where it went. No, I've no idea where it's gone. Anyway, let's persevere, Graeme.
Right.
You were saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just saying that, you know, probably if you get 40% of the popular vote, you'll get most of the seats through first past the post, 40 to 42%. But I mean, with 50, if you get just over the 50%, then, you know, you're likely to. I think it's more or less a done deal that you would get a significant majority of the seats. But that's by the way. But the position is that as I say, in order to satisfy international norms, we have to get a majority of the popular vote. That's the position.
And are you happy with the SNP's position?
No, I'm not happy. In fact, I tried to change it at the last conference, but the conference committee wouldn't accept the resolution that was proposed. So basically, I had to move the direct negative to what was proposed, and I was unsuccessful in that. But I mean, I know, having talked to a few of the leaders in the SNP, they agree with me that the chances of a UK government and prime minister agreeing to another referendum is few and far between. It's virtually impossible. So we're now going to have to sort of discuss, you know, what we can do in order to deliver independence, and not just, you know, speak about it and promote it. But because what is crucial in my view is that with 50% plus of the people being for independence, but only roughly, say, 35% of the population or the electorate is saying they're going to support the SNP, then the SNP has got to concentrate on that missing 15%. And why are they not supporting the SNP? And I would humbly suggest that we have not a delivery mechanism to deliver independence, not advance independence. We've been trying to advance independence for now at the delivery stage, and so if you can deliver it, you deliver it. If not, you're just a pressure group. And I think you've got to be honest with the public and say you're either a delivery unit or you are a pressure group. And that's the debate which we now have to have in Scotland.
It just seems so very tardy. You know, the SNP's been at this business now for what, 50 odd years, maybe more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just more or less reiterating.
Whoops. Oh my. The gremlins have struck again. I'm not sure, with the greatest of respect to our audience, that it's worthwhile persevering with in the circumstances. I hate to do this because I did say earlier that everyone ought to be tenacious. And you could argue, well, come on, there's only, we're well over the halfway point, and maybe what we should do is persevere to the end. Oh, well, Graeme is back, I think.
Yeah. Do you hear me, John?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yep. Sorry, I think this is probably the last throw of the dice in this particular case, I think. But no, I mean, Margaret Thatcher said we had to vote for it. Now, I'm not sure whether it was, I think in her stage it was a majority of the seats, but I don't think that is sustainable, as I've already said. But the introduction of the Scottish Parliament actually did not actually affect the legal position of our right to dissolve, because the Parliament is a creation of Westminster. So we've actually got to go back to what if the Parliament had never been created, or what if in 1975, when we had the SNP breakthrough, and what if they had actually won a majority of the vote or the seats at that particular stage? What would have been the position then? Well, the position would have been that we could have actually, proceeded to dissolve the Union. And that position has not been changed by the intervention of the Scottish Parliament at all, in a legal sense at all. Because, as I say, the Scottish Parliament is a creation of the Westminster system. It's not basically anything to do with the Treaty of Union as such.
I mean, let me ask you this question. From what I gather, the SNP is saying if they get a majority of the seats, then that will be regarded as an important factor in deciding what to do with the Union. But the reality is that at present, the SNP has the majority of the seats and isn't doing anything about it.
Well, I mean, the position is that you get a majority of the seats, and they've said that would then allow them to start to negotiate. But you can only negotiate if you've got somebody who's prepared to negotiate on the other side. And I
but you also have to say why things have changed. If you have a majority at present, what's the difference between the future majority and the present majority?
People would say that the current SNP MPs were not elected on basically a mandate to dissolve the Union or negotiate the dissolution of the Union or independence. I mean, I'm not saying I support that, but that would be their excuse.
I know it's not your position, Graeme, but it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, the SNP has made clear for decades now that it is a party whose aim is separation. To turn around and say, we just found out that you're separatists, it is an extraordinary argument.
Yeah, I mean, I don't doubt the illogicality of the whole thing at all. But I mean, we are where we are. They weren't prepared. They weren't prepared to basically take the matter in their own hands. They would probably say that they did try to negotiate in some shape or form, but it was obviously not particularly enthusiastically done, or done with any particular great vigor. So, the position is that we are where we are, and in order, I think, to proceed to negotiate the dissolution of the Union, then you've basically got to impose a sanction, because otherwise the other side won't do anything. And the sanction is that if you do not negotiate and discuss this with us and we come to an agreement, then we will dissolve the Union. That is the sanction. But we don't discuss that. We don't challenge the unionists to that. And it was interesting what Martin Geisler, when he challenged Cole Hamilton on the Sunday show about how the basically what the mechanism for Scotland becoming independent was. And of course, he was all over the place. The guy Cole Hamilton, he just didn't know, or he wasn't prepared to speak about that. So we've got to actually speak about it ourselves and challenge them, say, we are serious about a dissolution of the Union. And you've got to remember that a dissolution of the Union is not a unilateral declaration of independence. That's what colonies do. We are not a colony. We are part of a voluntary union, which the unionists love to tell us. So in order to leave that union, we can do it voluntarily. And that's what we're going to do, unless they come to the table and actually discuss and negotiate how we're going to separate. And the other thing I would say is that, this can be a positive thing, particularly for England too. They should look, and the SNP and other nationalists should actually be saying to our English friends, consider what dissolution of the union, what benefits you would get from that too. Consider what would be good and advantageous for you, so that we basically rejig the whole relationship in these islands about how we go forward. And I think that there is a positivity in that, and it's not purely a negative thing at all for England. England is a great country. It's got very many attributes, but it's different from us. It's got really probably different outlooks, different values in many respects. And they've got to find their own way in the world, just as we've got to find our own way too.
Yeah. Graeme, at one point you were planning to run against John Swinney for leader of the SNP, but you changed your mind. Why was that?
Well, basically, I was approached 2 days before the deadline by a government minister, not John, and they tried to persuade me not to stand, and they said I wouldn't win, and I said, well, with all due respect, you don't know that. But basically, I was invited to speak to John, and John phoned me. And he then invited me up to his home to have a meeting. And we had a meeting on the Sunday, by which time I had the requisite number of votes. Not only that, I had over 40 constituencies represented in these votes. So I had more than covered the threshold. But we had a long discussion. It was well over an hour. And I went to him with certain proposals that I thought were really essential to be part of the Scottish Government and the SNP's programme in order to deliver independence. And in the course of the conversation, it became very plain to me that John and I actually shared an awful lot of what I was trying to say and what I was trying to persuade the party to do. He actually turned to me towards the end of the conversation and said, look, I will give you a note of my responses to your particular issues which you've raised. And if you're happy with that, would you be prepared to give me the opportunity to go ahead as the leader of the party? So it was his initiative. He provided me with this note, and he wanted it to be kept, the actual detail of it to be kept private, just which I have agreed to. But I have this note, which gave me the confidence, which I hope is not misplaced. I don't think it will be, but gave me the confidence to think that he is going to basically make or attempt to make significant changes, both internally and also in the approach to independence, which the party must have. Because, as I've said before, it's only through our MPs, our political representatives, that we are actually going to be able to deliver independence at the end of the day in a legal way, which is accepted by the international community. And
so Graeme, what did he change his mind about that convinced you?
Well, I'm not saying he changed his mind. Actually, from the conversation I had, I think actually he's probably felt a lot of the same things I felt for some considerable time. I've mentioned to you about the fact that we think it is highly unlikely that there would be a UK Prime Minister who would be prepared to give Scotland a referendum. I think he also agrees with me that is it possible now to both manage devolution and also deliver independence? Because what has happened since Brexit and this the introduction of what shall we call muscular unionism, that the actual powers of the Scottish Parliament are getting less now the longer the SNP are in power as a devolved administration. And I think he recognised that to be the case. So we're at this sort of crossroads here, is can you actually manage devolution now as well as prosecute independence?
I think that's the trouble. I think the concern a lot of people have is that they see lots of the former and not much of the latter.
Well, I think that's right. But of course, we do remember that, you know, the SNP took the view that they would seek to they would cooperate with the devolution project, and they would seek to become the government and try and govern in a responsible way. And I think, despite all the kind of problems which there have been late, which I think are much less than what people like to think they are, they have done very well, because the position is that we enjoy in Scotland far better benefits and rights, even within the devolved situation, than our friends in England or Wales have.
Yeah.
And as a result, so the SNP have done pretty well. They've done pretty well as managing devolution. But we've now reached a stage, because of this muscular unionism from Westminster, where there is more than a question mark about whether you can actually continue to manage devolution while prosecuting independence. Now, my thought is that, and I've always thought this about being an SNP government, a devolved government, is that you should act as if you're already independent as much as you possibly can. Now, we know there are constraints within the devolution settlement regarding that, but we haven't actually, our government hasn't actually explored to what extent they can actually push these boundaries of devolution.
Yeah. I mean, I would, sorry to interrupt, Graeme, I would agree with all of that. I think the independence parties have been very unassertive when it comes to the Constitution.
Yeah,
and that's a sad thing, and it suggests that there isn't the depth of knowledge there on a technical level that would give people confidence, and certainly doesn't give them confidence of working outside the boundaries set by Westminster. I think within those boundaries there's a high comfort level. I think outside of those boundaries there isn't much of a confidence level. Oh, we seem to have lost you again, Sugar. Just when it was, just when the discussion was getting particularly interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that on this occasion we're going to be able to get Graeme back. Our producer is trying to encourage him to do so, but it may well be that we've exceeded the limits of his internet connection so comprehensively that we might not be able to get him back. But we'll give it another try, because many of you are signalling that you're enjoying the conversation. That being so, there's every reason to continue with it. I'm sorry to tell you that I've lost, or my system here has lost, all of your questions. I get communications from our producer, Kevin, but I don't get any of the questions. So forgive me if I haven't taken any questions from you. It's simply because the software has chosen to exclude your questions. And no doubt we'll be able to get to the foot of that in due course, but it may not well be manage to manage that before the end of the program. We've only got 10 minutes to go. Yeah, we're still trying to get John back. I think the point I was making, I'm hoping that he'll be able to suggest an answer to us, is that the Westminster has become much more assertive on the Constitution. They're in the driver's seat because power devolved is power retained. So any time they can breach their own arrangement, they can break at any time on any pretext. They could abolish the Scottish Parliament. And people say, well, they wouldn't do that because it would create a problem. Well, so what, they'll say. Who cares? I mean, Keir Starmer, for example, may say, look, I'm sitting in a majority of 200 to 300 MPs. The hell do I care? You know? I've always regarded the Scottish Parliament as being like a county council anyway. And if I can change a county council in England, I can easily change what you guys have got up there. And you're terribly precious about it. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, will you really, really persevere? I don't think so. And that may be his logic. If that's his logic, then there's absolutely no way that you can even begin to start negotiations, even with a small n, in these circumstances without being forceful. And I think the point has been reached now where there has to be diplomatic efforts, but they need to be assertive, as Graeme was suggesting. It's not sufficient to sit back and say, well, in the fullness of time, a Westminster government will emerge, which will be sensitive. Frankly, I can't see it. There is nothing in the track record that suggests any such thing may happen. I think what happened was that perhaps there's some accuracy in the statement and the thought that Alex Salmond was particularly fortunate in having David Cameron as PM because Cameron wasn't the sharpest tool in the box. And I think it was possible to persuade him to agree to a referendum. But I can't see that ever being repeated, frankly, because I think the lesson that was learned from that by Westminster was it was a close run thing, and we're never going to do that again. And if that's so, and I'm sure it is the case, all they'll do is keep saying now is not the time. I mean, it's what people have said over the years. When you get separatists or secessionists or independence movements, they say, no, we're not against it, it's just not the time. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things happening. Why are you getting wrapped around the axle on this? Hi, Graeme, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm still in the land of the living.
Good for you. That pernicious echo appears to have disappeared as well, which is great.
Right. Oh, that's good.
I was, while you were not with us, I was belaboring the point, perhaps, that the main party in favour of major constitutional change is somewhat unassertive about bringing that to happen. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, I would agree with that. But I think that is one of the matters which I discussed and reached some agreement on with John. So I think to a certain extent, maybe because this general election has arrived sooner than we thought, that has to some extent had affected it. But I fully expected that by the time we got to our national conference at the end of August, there would be certain indications that there was going to be a change of emphasis and a change in the in the policies of the party and also the Scottish government. Because the one thing I did ask him, and which he did accede to in the report, is that it wasn't just going to be party policy that was going to be reviewed and things, it was also the Scottish government. And obviously, because of the result of the general election, that will obviously have a bearing on what is decided and discussed at the national conference, because we thought the national conference was going to be before the general election, but obviously it's not going to be now. So that will have an effect on it, but it shouldn't necessarily affect the overall principle of our route or the different routes to independence which might still be available to us. And we shouldn't actually cancel anything out, but we should actually be in control of certain routes which we can do legally in an international context, be very well aware of that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, what I was discussing while you were offline, Graeme, was that the main party of independence is somewhat unassertive when it comes to changing the constitution. It seems to be very leery. It seems to have an easy acceptance of the fact that Westminster runs things and you don't want to be too pushy. You don't want to be seen as being overly dogmatic, and you're going to spend most of your time waiting until Westminster somehow comes to a view that what you've been saying for 100 years has some validity. I think it must strike a lot of people as being a somewhat tepid way of presenting your case.
Yeah, I think one of the things to bear in mind is that we have a civil service, which is the British Civil Service. And with all due respect to the civil servants who advise the Scottish Government, there are bound to be some of them who are not particularly well inclined towards independence. And I have certainly found in relation to other matters where the advice given to Scottish ministers by civil servants has been wrong. And as a result of that...
I would agree with that. I mean, there's no question. I mean, my experience of dealing with the administration and the Scottish government was that they were stuffed to the gunnels with lawyers, which they construed as being the same thing as constitutional experts, and they're just not the same thing. And but equally, I've found ministers far too willing to accept advice from people who really didn't know what they were talking about.
Yeah, well, I agree entirely with that, and I have challenged Scottish Government ministers on different points, and you know, I've even had them admit and say, "Well, I didn't know that was the case," and then in the next breath say, "I have every confidence in my civil servants." Yeah,
I found that too. We're overrunning a little bit, but let's just carry on for another 5 minutes or so because we've lost so much of you today.
Right. I mean, the one other thing that I did suggest, and I don't know whether this will be pushed forward or not, but I thought it was really important that we have an independence delivery unit.
Yeah.
Without civil servants, but basically created by the leader of the party and the First Minister, and these would be people who are basically recognised nationalists who have done an awful lot of the spade work, whether it's on currency, on the national banks, on constitutional law, all these things, but actually get them in the room to work for a limited period of time.
More than anything else, I'll tell you what they need. They need somebody who's an expert on constitutions elsewhere, so that they can actually go forward. We already have that. Sorry,
we already have that, and in fact, there is a shovel-ready constitution already available to get us over the line.
Yeah, but I know because I was involved.
So was Mike Russell and other people.
Yeah, I know. I was involved with Mike and also with Elliot Boomer in making sure that happened. But that took decades, Graeme. And
but I mean, it's basically ready now, so it's available in order to get us over the line.
The key thing is not to have it ready. The key thing is to educate people as to why it's necessary, because. Unless I'm very much mistaken, most people inside the SNP, and certainly most Scots, don't regard a constitution as being anything useful. And unless you change that attitude, it's going to be very difficult to implement constitutional change because people don't know what it is. And I hear government ministers south of the border talking about, well, that's unconstitutional, as if it had some relevance or meaning. It just doesn't. In the British setting, that is an irrelevant comment, because there's no way to prove one way or the other because it's not written down in any specific place. So anybody can say anything. I think what they mean, sorry, just let me finish. I think what they mean is it's unconventional, which is a very different thing.
No, I would take the view that what we're talking about is a constitution which we can introduce on day one of independence, and then which, as I say, is already it's oven ready. And it's not going to scare the horses. It's pretty conventional in the way it's been drafted, etc. It doesn't go into the issue of, for example, of whether we're going to be a monarchy or a republic. That can wait until later when as a nation we can discuss what the next constitution is going to be when we are independent. But the position is, I would say, as a lawyer, I would say actually we are in a better position in the fact that Britain does not have a specific written down constitutional document.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir there.
I think there's advantages for us to have that. Not having a so-called written constitution such as they have in Spain, etc. So I don't think that's a problem. But I think if we start discussing the issue of dissolution, and particularly discussing it and taking it to our the people, our opponents in the unionist side, they will then start to be in the back foot, because then it's all part of trying to justify the union as well, and why we shouldn't dissolve it. So it really puts them on the defensive, and that is the thing we've not been doing. We've not been putting them on the defensive.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it was, I can't remember who said it now, but independence is never granted, it's taken.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is very simple. Why should anyone disturb the status quo? I mean, yeah. Graeme, this has been a really good discussion. I deeply appreciate you persevering.
And you too.
And dare I say, our audience too. It's been a wee bit disjointed, but I think, and I hope people will agree with me, that what we have been able to hear of you has made so much sense. And I hope that you're able to continue. And I hope that these discussions that you had bear fruit. And there is one little favour I'd like to ask of you, and it's this. If you are in contact with John Swinney, on behalf of us, assuming that is the case, you might care to invite him on the show on our behalf, if you're in touch with him. And I'd be very grateful, because it's an opportunity for him to talk directly to an audience of people in the way that you have, and put some points across. And we could talk about some of the things that you discussed tonight. So are there any last comments you would like to make before we close, Graeme?
No, I would be more than delighted to ask John if he would take part in one of your programs. I think it's going to be very exciting to see what's happening in the next 2 or 3 months, culminating with the party conference. And I hope, and I'm looking for signs that there are significant changes, and that we become much more determined in delivering independence and not just talking about it.
Great, that's fantastic. Now, I want to make a suggestion, yet another one, which is that once that conference is over and you've had a chance to reflect over its deliberations, would you like to come back on the show? Yes,
be delighted to do so.
Let's do that then. That's a date then. Let's do that. And this time, in between times, if we can smarten up your internet connection or put in some other mechanism that allows you to say and talk about some of the things you've been talking about tonight, I think that would be great. Super. Again, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to make a few closing remarks. If you could stick around for a few seconds afterwards, I'd be very grateful, Graeme.
Okay, will do.
Thank you. Well, there you are, folks.
Much,
it's a great pleasure, Graeme. And it's been another super show, maybe not technically, for which I apologise, but nonetheless, listening to Graeme has been interesting and enlightening, and dare I say, educational. Next week we have Jason and hopefully Ed on the show to talk about the Indy app. And that's going to be, technology is going to make all the difference in the world, I have to say, as we go forward. The Indy app is one thing. We talked earlier, a couple of shows ago about the app, which allows you to check if you're on the voters roll and all the rest of it. So all of this stuff is tremendously exciting, and as public prints and stuff like that, they sort of fade away in importance. The technology will make it much more possible to be constantly in touch with people. And these are some great steps along the way. So join us next week to talk to Jason and Eddie. Thank you all for joining us, and take care. Look after yourselves. And remember, it's not the people who are doing evil acts that are the problem. It's the folks standing there watching them and not intervening. So With all of that, thank you, good night, and see you next week. Ciao.